of the foundation, so we're not against dogs yet. So, welcome again to those of you who sit out there in the world to our 30th anniversary lecture series on Peace by Peaceful Means from TFF in Lund, Sweden. And I'm glad also to see all you people being here from more close localities. Thank you very much for coming for our birthday, if you will. It's a great joy to see you and to see some of the people who also have, as volunteers and otherwise, and young students have been part of building up what we have created in TFF. So thank you so much. And this lecture is about not, if you will, Yugoslavia as such, because that requires more than 20 minutes. But it's a little bit about Yugoslavia first, and then the project that TFF had over all of these years. And I'm happy also to see Kerstin Schulz and Søren, who the three of us have plowed through Yugoslavia in the war days. And I remember when we went in September '91 into Osijek in eastern Slavonia, and some of these half-drunken local militia people stopped us on the road. We had rented a car which was white. It looked like a UN car, but it wasn't. We had just taken off the number plates and get into the war zone. It was a mad project, by the way. But we're still here, so we survived, as you can see. And we were stopped, and he said, if you want to get in to visit the center and the mayor, whom we had an appointment to meet with, Mr. Kramaric, who was the closest you come at that time in Croatia to a Gandhi. If you want to get in there, we can drive before you, in front of you, but you will be at least at 140, and you don't have your safety belts on, because you might need, if there are mines on the road, to get out quickly. And then we drove, and then I remember Søren's comment was, I'm not a war reporter. To which I said, now you are. That was a terrible thing, but it gave us an opportunity to understand Yugoslavia better than most other people who never set foot there, at least. So, Yugoslavia happened, and I say Yugoslavia because it's also my country. It's the country I have as my third country in my life, and Yugoslavia was something very important. I'm partly educated in Yugoslavia in '74 and onwards. Dubrovnik at Inter University Center. And don't ever tell me that there was not a civil society in communist Yugoslavia. There was a tremendous intellectual discussions in all republics, crisscross political spectrums. So, this Yugoslavia fell apart in around '91. The first shot, I think, was in Pakrac in April, and Pakrac in Croatia. And the conflict, of course, came much earlier than the shooting. The first shot is always a consequence of, you know, things that were simmering under the surface for many years. And that Yugoslavia happened at a very unfortunate time. As Håkan Wiberg wrote again and again, it had a very bad prediction. Due to the big changes in the world, due to the fact that it was difficult to remain a so-called neutral state, due to the fact that the Soviet Union had fallen apart, due to a lot of other, I mean, I won't get into that because then it gets too complicated and too long and winding. But that was a time when in people's minds were the idea of the East-West conflict between the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, and the West, liberal democracy, NATO, EU. That image of Europe was transferred down on Yugoslavia in the sense that the Serbs were immediately seen as the bad Christians, the Orthodox Serbs, cast in the role of the bad Russians, the aggressive Russians, the greater expansive guys. So you had the story about Greater Serbia everywhere. In the Western media, you never heard about Greater Slovenia, Greater Croatia, Greater Bosnia, and Greater Macedonia, and Greater Albania. You didn't hear these things. You heard about Greater Serbia. And Greater Serbia was a plan. It was not a plan to do it, but it was, among intellectuals, something that existed. So the unfortunate thing was that the old Cold War structure in people's minds, politicians, media, and other people, were the Cold War that was transferred there. So Serbia were the bad guys, and Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, etc. were the freedom-loving Westerners, the small, if you will, Western countries that we automatically should support. Secondly, the original intervention, intellectual, was done by people who said we must keep Yugoslavia together and help these people to live together. Whereas in 91, 92, the European Union opened the feast by recognizing Slovenia and Croatia out of the existing state, which was a UN founding member. By doing that and having absolutely no idea about what to do with the rest of Yugoslavia when you carved out two republics by decision, which happened in December, if I remember. It was a decision taken in December 15, 16 in the night under the leadership of Germany. The United Germany's first task was to split Yugoslavia under the leadership of Hans-Dietrich Genscher. And that done, and we were all warning against this, because with Slovenia and Croatia out of Yugoslavia, there was no way in which you could avoid the war in Bosnia. And in historical perspective, I'm very happy and proud that the intellectuals of TFF were among the first to say this and try to influence politics. For God's sake, don't do it, because it means war in Bosnia. That war broke out in April. It broke out on the same day as the Serbs remembered Hitler's bombardment of Belgrade. Do not tell me that the German Foreign Ministry did not know which day the 5th of April was. The message was sent. We're carving up the country in which you are majority. And the West then decided not to care for the problem that the Serbs had, namely that they were minorities in all the other republics except Slovenia. And that's where you have the Krajina problem in Croatia. The 12 to 15% of the Croatian people who at the time were Serbs. And they had not invaded it as part of Greater Serbia. The Serbs came to this area to defend Europe. It's called the Krajina area in Croatia, which was the border to the Ottoman Empire. The Serbs had lived in Croatia for 400 years at the time. In the Western media, they were considered invaders by the People's Army. You know, the whole picture was extremely wrong and superficial. But I also admit it is not easy to understand the complexities of Yugoslavia. I used to say to my students, if you understand Yugoslavia, you will get hold of most of the other things too. Test yourself in Yugoslavia if you can manage that. The complexities of the republics, the autonomies, the peoples, the narodni, the mixtures, the history, the religion, and the immensely interesting role of Yugoslavia in the international system. If you can hold all this together, you probably will become a good conflict researcher and peacemaker, perhaps. So, all that said, Yugoslavia was much more important for Europe than the fall of the wall. Now, this may surprise you. It was in Yugoslavia everything was tested out that came later. The idea of humanitarian intervention, Joschka Fischer, human rights people, peace people, the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society not being able to say no to military intervention there. It was a place where for the first time NATO went out of its area and bombed Serbia to carve out Kosovo in 99 after 77 days of bombing. Ruthless bombing. I know what I talk about because I was there. And I stood on the 6th floor of the Moskva hotel in the center of Belgrade. On the 6th floor I could feel the pressure wave up through my body from the bombs that fell 10 kilometers outside of Belgrade. Don't imagine that it was small, nice, kind of human bombs they used in Yugoslavia. They tested it. They tested their newer weapons, and they tried to destroy the Batanica air base, which was made to withstand nuclear weapons, and they did not make it hold in it, but they had wanted to do it. It was also the place where the Badinter Commission could argue that Slovenia and Croatia could become independent states, without ever asking what our common friend Milovan Djilas at the time told us after the Second World War, they drove around in a jeep and asked people which part of the republics, which side of the border between the republics that people wanted to, from house to house, which side of the border would you like to be? And there they drew the border. Nobody ever thought of how catastrophic it was to take a federation like Yugoslavia and carve it up in 6 parts and make each international borders. With a Serb population who were 42% of Yugoslavia and who had minorities in all the other places. Except Slovenia, as I said. Slovenia is the most homogeneous republic, and therefore fewer problems there, therefore better situation today. All the other things was immensely complicated. And you had this, referendum of Bosnia that followed this. To the interesting information for those of you who are interested in it, there were only a few Serbs who participated in that referendum. The rest boycotted it. 1/3 of Bosnia's people have never accepted Bosnia as an independent state. The West never told you that. Western media never told you that. You were just told that the Serbs were bad guys like Karadzic and Mladic, and all Serbs were like them. And so you had the Dayton Peace Agreement from December '95, after which we haven't heard much, because naive people think that everything is okay when somebody has put together peace accord something, somewhere at the airbase in the US having the same name. Now what did they do? They avoided ever to ask the Yugoslavs, the people in all these republics, what they wanted. The instrument of referendum that we used, for instance, in southern Denmark in 1920 was never used, or in Åland Islands. Ask people what they want. Never did that. We told them, we are carving up your country. Carving up your country, and if a Serb wants to get from there to there, he has to have a visa. In his own country. The Croats the same, of course. So you can go on like this. There were so many mistakes. I may speak a little bit longer. There were so many mistakes made. And it's time somebody looks back and learns something from it, because we repeated the same mistakes in the Western world from Yugoslavia. There's no republic today where life is better than it was in the old Yugoslavia. In several of these republics there were more democracy under Tito, and I was there, and that's my impression, than there is today. You see, under Tito in the old Yugoslavia there was a separation of power between economic power, political power, military power. And there were 6 different communist parties. When Tuđman took over Croatia, he gathered all this power, the economic power, the political power, and the military power in his own hands, and his hard-set party, half fascist as it was, supported by the West. Okay. So the West did also the 2 massacres on the Serb population, Operation Storm and Flash. Never apologized to the Serbs for that. And I wonder who masterminded Srebrenica. Srebrenica could have been avoided if the international community had given the United Nations the troops it needed, namely 32,000 UN peacekeepers to keep the 6 safe zones of Bosnia safe. They got 1,200 Turks. And at the time when it happened, the United Nations peacekeeping unit was broke economically because of certain countries not having paid their dues. That is the UN you blame for Srebrenica. Thank you very much. We have something to talk about. So, this was in the midst of so-called civilized Europe. Afterwards, the EU got the prize, the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, which is already a joke, because it's gone to a lot of war makers, but that's okay. Not what are we talking about here, but the only time when the European Union have come together and spoken with one voice on an important issue was to unite in recognizing Slovenia and Croatia out of Yugoslavia, which led to the war in Bosnia. This is what you are, if you don't know anything about history and have forgotten everything, you can give the EU the prize, Nobel Peace Prize. So, and what was it we did? We were a number of people in the board and associated with the TFF in '91 who happened to know Yugoslavia. From student days, from diplomacy, from travels and whatever. And we were, I think, up to 10 people who in different groups and teams went to Yugoslavia, to all parts of it. Not to boast about it, but the figure I know best is I myself made more than 3,000 interviews in former Yugoslavia with all people from Slobodan Milosevic and other leaders to refugees, taxi drivers, school children, politicians, cultural people, etc. Immensely interesting, wonderful country, fabulous people with a deep sense of culture and history, which we, to a certain extent, have thrown overboard in the rest of the West. So, we travelled down there, and we were pioneers, I'm afraid I can say, in going as academics, putting on flapjacks and helmets, renting a car, taking the risk, nobody would insure those cars, and going into these places, being shot at, being arrested, etc., etc. We survived somehow. We were good at negotiation, and we drank a lot of Slivovich with some of the local patrols, who, when we had been singing the songs, they let us go. I remember one evening, one night, when we managed to get arrested first by the Serbs on the one side, and then getting over into Croatia, and getting arrested on the Croatian side too, until I had to call the chief of the intelligence service of Croatia, whom I was on surprisingly good terms with. I'm not usually on very good terms with intelligence people. And called him up and said, could you let us go? Because he knew what we were doing, and he thought it was important what we did. So we went there, we wrote reports, and we did alternative peace plans. We were a number of people who worked 4 years as advisors both to 3 governments in Belgrade and to the non-violent, at the time, leadership of Kosovo under Dr. Rugova and the LDP party. That's a Japanese party, but what was it called?
LDK.
LDK, that was okay, thank you so much. Never be taken with your acronyms down, it happened here. Sorry. But, who decided behind the back of him that NATO should solve that problem? NATO's guys said, let's bomb Serbia so Kosovo can be an independent state. We know that that would not be necessary to create a good idea. We published 10 different plans for how the future of Serbia and Kosovo could be together. Anything from one state to more states or whatever, but the only thing we said was, it cannot be done by military means. And we were proved right. I'm not ashamed of saying that. Today's Kosovo is not a viable state, and it will not be. And Europe has already received 100,000 people from Kosovo, not because they're persecuted or tortured, but because they can't find any economic means of living. So, it is all, if you're interested, put down in what I find an interesting academic project. Namely a blog, which, if I can find it here, this is called Yugoslavia, What Should Have Been Done. Yugoslavia, What Should Have Been Done. And we were the only people who not only made the analysis, the diagnosis and the prognosis, but we were also coming up with what it could look like, what should have been done instead. The 3 authors of that happens to be my 2 dear mentors. Well, I have more mentors than 2, but 2 of my very dear mentors. Håkan Wiberg, in memoriam of whom I hold this lecture today, because he was such a dear friend. He was with us from, we started in '85 till he died in 2010. A walking encyclopedia, as Johan Galtung said at his funeral. We didn't Google things at the time when we were with Håkan. We Wiberged it. Håkan Wiberg, Wiberg. And a lovely person who had spent a lot of years in Yugoslavia. The other author is Johan Galtung, who turns 85 this UN Day in October, whom I have known since '68, when he came to my school in Denmark, where I was a pupil. And we have worked together since 1974, so I pay respect to him too. The 3 of us have published this blog with all the materials we wrote from 1990 till today, unedited, unchanged. We've just edited, you know, commas and misspellings and things like that. But everything we said at that time, you know, when we published in '92 about what would happen or why Dayton was not a good idea, is all in that blog unchanged. You can go and see, what is it, 2,500 pages, A4 pages equivalent. You can go and see where we went wrong and where we were right and where we were in the middle. And how complicated that conflict was, and how irresponsibly and recklessly it was treated, and how arrogantly it was treated by the Western world, in particular, US, France and Germany at the time. So I'm not going to say much more of that. It's now up to anybody who's interested in contemporary history of Europe, but I insist that this conflict is more important than the end of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, because that was where everything was tested out. That was where NATO was out of area. That was where we bombed us to a new state. I mean, what Putin did in Crimea is relatively little crime compared with Kosovo and bombing of Serbia. It was where human rights people began to argue for militarism. It was where peace people did, and the women's groups split. Because, yes, the only thing these primitive people will understand is that we bombed them in Serbia and in Bosnia. That was where the UN was made to fail by its leading members. Was made to fail and have not been talked much about since then. Have you heard anybody but people in TFF who has advocated UN peacekeeping around Ukraine? Nobody talks about the UN anymore. It's the most competent peacekeeping organization we have, who've done tremendous good around the world. Since Bosnia, it has been sidelined completely, which also has to do with the fact that they have the most spineless Secretary General in the history of the United Nations. But there will come somebody after him, and we could all try to resurrect that. Until we have something better, for God's sake, don't destroy the UN and its charter. It's the most Gandhian document we have, signed by governments in the world. So, I'm sorry to say, old Yugoslavia was probably better for everybody. And I'm not a nostalgist. The first report we published was called After Yugoslavia What? We were not just saying keep it together. But we thought that if you are a doctor or psychologist or lawyer who comes in and help a family with problems, you don't make everything worse for all the family members. And if you do, you're a lousy one. And that's what I am prepared to say today. They destroyed a country that I love deeply also, and which was unique and different from anything else in Europe's modern history, for good reasons and for bad reasons. There was certainly a need for pluralism and diversity in Europe, instead of the Europe we're now creating, where the same economy is applied, the same military is applied, the same human rights concepts are applied, and we have this big monotony in the Western world, which is one reason we're going down, relatively speaking. They are more creative elsewhere. So, dear Yugoslavia, I refuse to say rest in peace, because I think it will probably come together again like Scandinavia. And secondly, because I refuse to connect death and peace. Rest in peace is an awful, R-I-P, is an awful word. Peace is conviviality, life, play, fun, development, change. It is not death. So thank you very much. And now we will take all kinds of questions, criticism, throwing tomatoes and eggs. Non-violently, please.
Jan, the title of your lecture was Yugoslavia, What Should Have Been Done.
Yes.
Today, an important question is Yugoslavia, what could be done now?
What can be done now is, of course, to see to it that those parts which are not already members of NATO will not join NATO. Because that will be anti-Russian, and we don't need that. Secondly, that young people come together and, if you will, sing the songs. When we worked with reconciliation in eastern Slavonia, Vukovar, Osijek, and these places, we found out how easy it was to make young people come together, play guitar, eat pizza together, and say, why did all this happen to us? Why did we sit in refugee camps? It was our parents who created this. And I always was taught at home that I should hate all Serbs, or the other one would say, I was always told at home that I should hate all Croats. Young people will begin to link up again, and they'll find out that they have more in common with each other than they have with, NATO or the US or something else. Secondly, I think it's a matter of getting the economy going. And I don't know how that can happen in a Europe where we have so much economic problems as we have. I've no idea how to do this. But I would wish to think back on the time when Yugoslavia had 4 or 5 different economies on the same territory. And if one didn't work, they could switch littles to the other. They were not vulnerable the same way they are today, because they're now getting integrated into the EU and the neoliberal kind of thinking. I think they have a tremendous cultural potential, and at least some of these states will, if we keep on treating them this way, they will turn away and join, BRICS countries or the rest of the world, or Russia or whatever, or Turkey. But they will not be part of the Europe if we keep on this way. So yes, I think there's a lot that can be done. If you ask me, I mean, I've had several conversations with leaders in former Yugoslavia. I always said, if you want a defense, defend yourself. There was a tradition in Yugoslavia to have self-defense, weapons at home, and trained to a certain extent in non-violent resistance too. Don't get a part of NATO. Secondly, think of alternative defense. Defensive defense methods. Make it a strong country should everybody, whatever republic it is, should anybody try to, invade you. But don't go with a big chrome NATO membership, because that is the end of your sovereignty. So with a little creativity, there is a lot that could be discussed. And I'm ready to restart this whole project for TFF again, if it could mean what should it look like in the future. But the generation that was set in by the West to lead these new republics are unfortunately still sitting there, basically. And then a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for each pair of groups. There's so much traumas in this area from history. There's so much lies and propaganda that led to these wars that some people have to sit down and talk without anger, without wish for revenge, but talk intellectually, historically. Make good history books so the children shall not learn the winner's history only and shall not just learn nationalistic history. That we have had enough of in this space, because when everything else falls apart, people fall back to religion and nationalism. I think actually Yugoslavia could be the model that Scandinavia used to be for an alternative new kind of humane thinking and justice. But I don't know. Maybe not in my lifetime, but it has tremendous potentials if they can actualize them.
More questions for John? The subject is extremely complicated.
It is.
So if one starts asking one question, there will be 5 different ones following. But try some.
And if you do it, please do it loudly so that it can be heard.
Okay,
Yeah,
I have
go for it.
so many questions. Together we interviewed Milovan Djilas during, I think, our second or third journey to former Yugoslavia. Could you today describe the conversation a little, because it was so interesting. You touched it before in your lecture, and what it means today. He was such a kind of special personality.
Well, first of all, he was one of the leading partisans. He was number 2 man in the system together with Tito, and then spent 6 years in prison writing his books, because he became Eastern Europe's first dissident. It was not Sakharov or somebody else. This was Milovan Djilas in his book, The New Class, in 1956 or 57, I'm not sure. And you and I met him when he was, getting older, in his flat in Belgrade. And he's a very controversial person. And that controversial person has to do with the fact that I remember 2 things from the conversation. It was in 1991, so, but it's all written down, and we'll get into my memoirs one day. That he said his main inspirations in his life politically had been Lenin and Gandhi.
Okay.
If you get these 2 together, there's something interesting. There's something interesting. Secondly, I remember that we asked him a question saying, since he was part of this partisan liberation struggle, that somebody had quoted him for saying that had we known what we did was impossible, namely to fight the Germans and the fascists and the Chetniks inside, the Serbian nationalists. Had we known that that struggle was impossible, we would never have succeeded in liberating Yugoslavia. That's a beautiful sentence. This is, to me, a sentence that is a piece in a nutshell. It may very well be looking like impossible to create a more peaceful world, but when we try and we don't say it is, or we don't know that it's impossible, then maybe we succeed a little bit. It's a beautiful way of saying it. But he was a man of wisdom. Right in front of you, I think, sir, and there's a whole shelf of his books. One of the things I have preserved now in my sorting out my library of 6,000 books, which is now only 1,200. And some of the books I kept was the whole production of Milovan Djilas, which is novels. enormously big history books, his own life and memoirs, and poetry. You know, such a person that you just could sit with for hours, very mild-mannered, very open, talkative, and at the same time, a war criminal. He has a lot of blood on his hands. And you know, there were people in Belgrade who say, why do you eat that man? I said, because he's also a human being, and I'm interested in knowing everybody who was part of this struggle, and Tito is dead, so what can you do? And I have the great pleasure of, whenever I've been in Belgrade since then, to sit down with his son, Alexei, who's one of the best intellectuals in this space. So, don't underestimate other peoples and their intellectuals and people of culture. There's something outside what we call the Western world, of Brussels and Washington and Copenhagen and Stockholm. Just a little advice to those who think that that is the world. It's not the world. And never talk down to people, and never talk about there not being an intellectual discussion. Never talk down about them having no civil society because communism didn't allow. Some of the most formidable intellectual treatises on modern society, etc., has been produced by Croats and Serbs and Bosnians. And we should learn from them. That's one reason we go out in the world instead of just reading books about it. We learn from people where they are. I might think more people who are sitting in these boring state-financed institutes should do the same. Sorry to say so. You don't learn it from meeting at conferences at Sheraton hotels. You learn something from putting on your thick shoes and getting out there and talk with people. That's what I have learned much more about Yugoslavia from than all the books I read about Yugoslavia. I used to say to my students, read all the books you can, but then when you sit with people out there, forget everything about these books and listen to what they tell you. That has worked quite well. Søren, you have written 4 books?
4 books, yes.
4 books, yes. There you see. Because you listen.
You still have questions?
Yeah, he wants to know what the 5th book should be about. Maybe the alternatives, Søren.
Of course.
Where should we go now? But I really suggest you read this, browse a little bit in this huge blog. It's one of the largest projects in TFF's 30 years history, and I'm proud of it. And therefore I also mention my 2 mentors, Håkan Wiberg and Johan Galton. We had 130 man-years of experience from former Yugoslavia. Not that many people have that. Johan started driving around a motorbike in '56. Håkan came in the 60s and I came in the 70s, and we loved the country and we loved the people. And they deserve to be loved. They have had enough suffering in their little space on earth. If you look at their history, there are few places where it has been so congested, suffering again and again and again. Not because they are primitive or atavistic, as you could read in the media, but because they are living in a difficult space, which makes it so fascinating. Yes? Somebody come up with a question now? No, it doesn't seem so.
Okay.
Do we see any questions on Facebook?
No,
Well, you usually come later on.
they come later.
They come later on sometimes, yes. Okay. Thank you so much for coming around. I know to many of you, Yugoslavia has also been very important. I'm glad you came today to have a little chat about that. Now we're going to have something to drink, maybe Slivovic, and talk more about how to revive that fantastic space in modesty and humility for the cultures and the capacities of that place. Thank you so much.